So, I want to take a few minutes and I want to kind of take a moment and discuss like some of the misconceptions or myths about writing that I tend to encounter amongst people unfamiliar with what the writing process kind of entails. So, I found this really good document on the St. Louis University site. And it's a PDF that kind of, touches on some of these common misconceptions or myths about the writing process. And this is just a good starting point. It's not a complete kind of overview of what I tend to see about myths and misconceptions about writing, but it's a good starting point. It tackles some of the most common misconceptions about writing. And this is especially important when we talk about, first year college students who are new to the academic community who have these misconceptions or these preconceived notions about what the writing process kind of entails. And so this document takes the time to kind of address some of these myths and misconceptions. And then I kind of want to take a few minutes and kind of unpack these ideas and these myths even further. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into the first one. So, according to this site, myth number one: only writers with problems need feedback. This is not true. Often, good writers, or what I say, I don't even like to say good writers, they're just more sophisticated writers. Experienced writers is a better term because they've been practicing with the writing process for a very long time. Experienced writers who understand the writing process know that good writers need feedback, and good writers understand addressing the needs of their audience. They understand that they're not writing just for themselves or just for one particular person, that they're really trying to work to bridge the connection between what the writer is trying to get across and how it's being conveyed to their audience or their readers. And so, in order to address that gap, um, experienced writers seek out feedback. They seek out having conversations about their writings with their peers. Oftentimes, it could be fellow colleagues, people who are in the discipline, or just family members. That's who I used to tend to rely on when I was trying to get some sort of feedback about how my text was kind of developing. So, sorry, experienced writers understand the need for that, having that feedback. So, that is myth number one. So, and that moves us on to myth number two, which is good writers write quickly and effortlessly. No. And some of the reasons why I think that less experienced writers tend to assume that is because by the time we see a piece of text, I mean, we're looking at the finished product and it looks effortless. It's cleaned up. The argument is sound. The writer unpacks all the terms and, that they want their audience to be aware of, and they bridge those connections between themselves and their audience. And so by the time we see that text, it's already polished, it's already finished. We didn't see all the revisions that, the writer had to undergo in order to bridge those connections, or having to restructure, rephrase, their paragraphs or their sentence structure to, clarify some of their ideas. We never see that. We are the audience. We see the end result, kind of like, when we watch a film, when we watch anything on Netflix. By the time we see it, it's streaming. It's a clean, polished product. It's a put together movie. We don't see all the editing. We don't see all the work that goes into creating this text, this film. So, and the same works for writing. By the time we see it, it's already polished. So that is another common misconception. So let's see, what is misconception number 3? So, myth number 3: good writers know exactly what they want to say before they start writing. Oftentimes not. Um, when I usually encounter first year college students, so much emphasis is placed on, their thesis. And yes, that is extremely important, especially when, your text starts moving from, those rough draft stages into a more polished final product. Yeah, you need a tight and coherent and clear thesis. But in the meantime, during those revision processes, during those stages, when you're trying to um, discover what it is that you're trying to say. And oftentimes, as we, move into our research, as our argument begins to develop, um, experienced writers are aware that they are going to be impacted by their sources. Their opinions are going to change and develop as, the argument progresses, and they remain open minded. So it's an understanding that, you know, writing is discovery. You're trying to discover what it is that you have to say about any given conversation. So, experienced writers understand the need to remain open minded as, the writing process progresses, as your text begins to become more developed, as the argument becomes more cohesive, as we start gathering more research. Experienced writers understand that all of that is going to impact us, and that we need to understand that we are, in a process of constant learning and discovery as we are developing these arguments in these texts. So that is very important. Sometimes I see basic writers struggle wanting to stay within the confines of their thesis, even though as they start, discovering their argument, that they start figuring out that their ideas are changing, and that their analysis is shifting, and that they need to reassess where it is that they stand in an argument. And I want to emphasize, it is much easier to change the thesis than it is to change your entire discovery process. Kind of embrace where the argument is going, see where it is that you're heading, and see how your ideas are shifting and changing, and then change your text accordingly. So, which moves us to myth number 4: readers want black and white explanations. And I think that what this is addressing is that any given argument has a black or white answer to it. So, like the impact of texting on writing, it's either negative or it's good, or texting is either impacting it or it's not. And as we know, it's much more complicated than that. And our readers understand that these topics have many, many layers to them. And there's so many gray areas in between that our readers want us to explore. You know, just as we are, a diverse person, and a complicated person as that, our readers and our audience members are just as complicated. And so we need to think about that. We need to think about how complicated these topics are, and how different, you know, readers may have different opinions. And we need to think of them as we formulate our argument. And I can't really think of a topic that is just clearly black and white. There's just topic these topics, these arguments, no matter what it is that we try to address, they are extremely complicated topics, and our readers demand that rigorous exercise to address how complicated these arguments actually are. So, which segues into myth number 5. Simple language seems dumb. No. Nothing is more painful than when I see somebody in either a written argument or even a verbal argument attempt to overcomplicate a topic by almost like they're going through a thesaurus and then replacing every word with something more complicated, more nuanced, and often more unfamiliar to their readers. And then it bogs down the meaning of the idea that they're trying to convey. And so the reader or the audience spends a fair amount of time just trying to dissect and unpack what it is that the speaker or the writer is trying to convey. And that's not saying that there isn't space for complicated sentence structures or, phrasing complicated ideas in a complicated way. That's not to say that. But what I am saying is that when we are examining complicated topics, and oftentimes we see experienced writers make the mistake where they isolate their audience by staying within complicated language, conveying these complicated ideas in complicated sentence structures by only seemingly to be in a conversation with other scholars who are familiar with these ideas and these texts so that they don't have to take the time to explain them and break them down in simple language. But what that does is it isolates people out of the conversation because the audience has to spend a fair amount of time just dissecting what it is that these, academics are discussing. So instead, what I think is a move that sophisticated and very experienced writers make is that they understand that they're going to have to bring different types of readers, different types of audience members to their discussion. And so one of the ways they do that is, they'll phrase a complicated idea within a complicated sentence structure, but then they follow it up with very simple language, simplifying the idea. So that way they're not isolating people out of the conversation. And so a lot of times basic writers assume that when they're phrasing an idea in a simplest of terms that they come across as dumb or unsophisticated, and that is not true. It is a mark of a sophisticated writer being able to take complicated ideas and break them down and explain them in the most simplest of terms so that way everybody's participating in the conversation. So, which moves us into myth number 6. A thesis statement should be one sentence long. This is not necessarily the case. A thesis statement should at least be one sentence long. And what I mean by a thesis statement is I mean a thesis statement that explains to your reader, to your audience, the purpose of your discussion, what your message is, how you're going to convey or support that message, and ultimately what you want your audience to take away from when they leave your discussion, essentially when they leave your essay. So, and that's explained in a thesis. Depending on the length of the assignment is going to have to, and how complicated the topic is going to determine the thesis. So what I like to get students to think about is not necessarily thinking of it in just one sentence, but making sure that you're addressing these questions as long as you have established to your audience the purpose of your text, the message that you hope to convey, how you're going to do it, and ultimately what you want them to take away when they leave your conversation. That can be in one sentence or that can be in a couple sentences. But if you're taking an entire paragraph to explain your thesis, that takes me to see the previous one or the previous myth. Simple language seems dumb. You need to be able to simplify it in order to bring people to the conversation. You need to simplify your argument in order for your readers or your audience members to remember that and be able to move on and be able to understand the progression of your argument. So, which takes me to myth number 7. Using I is always bad. Now, proceed with caution. I repeat, proceed with caution. Some instructors detest the use of I. It's too personal, that they're not interested in this, that you're supposed to be creating an argument based on facts, and I deals with feelings, etc., and so forth. So proceed with caution. So I would definitely get a feel for your instructor and to see what they privilege. And if your instructor does not like the use of the pronoun I, don't use it. But over here in the English department, we have been trying to dispel this myth of using I with caveats. Let me explain. So, using I is always bad. We've heard that time and time again. I remember hearing that 20 years ago in high school. And from what I hear from my students, it's still being perpetuated even to this day. So, but as the PDF says, no universal rule exists on using I. But if all you're saying is I argue this, I'm saying this, I'm doing this, then it comes across as a very biased text. It's an opinion and it has no support. All you've demonstrated is that you care about the topic. You haven't demonstrated that anybody else cares about the topic. And so there needs to be that fine balance when using that pronoun I. I would say, of course, you can use the pronoun I. It's your argument. You might as well own it. And it does give us as writers or even in a verbal argument, more stake in the discussion when you're saying, I am arguing this. I state this, right? It gives us, more ownership to what it is that we're trying to argue. But then you can't just keep saying, I think this, I think that. You need to follow that up with explaining how other people care about this topic as well. And that's your support. That's your demonstration that I don't just care about this topic, other people care about this topic as well. Therefore, hopefully through my argument, hopefully through my evidence, I'm going to convince you why you should care about this topic. And so that's why we say, yes, when appropriate, you can use the pronoun I, but proceed with caution because you're going to want to make sure that you're going to follow that up with some sort of support, right? You're not going to want to just come across as you're the only one that cares about this topic. When you're creating an argument through your resources, you're demonstrating that I don't just care about this, other people care about this topic as well. So, and then we go to myth number 8. He can function as neutral pronoun that refers to both men and women. As a rule of thumb, no. I am not a he, I'm a she. And when you're referring to a group of people, he does not default to a generic he and she amongst the members of the group. No. And I'm not saying to constantly write he or she, him or her throughout your essay. It looks redundant and it bogs down the essay. So in academic writing, what we do is we default to they, them, their, because that encompasses both sides of the spectrum, right? So, or all sides of the spectrum. So we're able to say they rather than he or she. Or, if we default and just say he, like in previous years, then are we talking about just the male members of the group? Are the female members are excluded? There's just a lot of messiness that goes along with it. And so we default to the generic they, them, their because that encompasses he and she with avoiding the redundancy of having to say him or her, he or she, etc. and so forth. So, and then we have myth number 9. The 5-paragraph essay format works for every assignment. No. In academic writing, we say you need as many supporting paragraphs as you need to convey and argue your thesis. So this is determined by the writer. This is where the writer comes in and has a lot of control. You need to think about what points need to be made in order to defend that thesis that you're proposing to your audience. Usually in your introduction, unless it's a delayed thesis, but that's another topic. So we have often been taught the 5-paragraph formula, and it was a good place to start. I'm not saying that it should be thrown out completely, but I do think that possibly maybe it should be introduced at an earlier age, and then hopefully by junior high and high school we start abandoning it altogether, because it's kind of like the training wheels to the writing process. So we do know that every essay needs to have an introduction. You need to have that foundation for your readers who are entering into the conversation with you. So you need a good foundation, and you do need a thesis. Your reader needs to know the direction, the destination of your argument, what you're going to argue throughout the paper, and then hopefully remind the reader of when you close the conversation in the conclusion. So, and then every essay needs supporting paragraphs because you need support for that thesis, and then you need a conclusion to close the discussion. But oftentimes, we don't take the training wheels away. So we have basic writers moving into the college academic arena where this is the structure that they're familiar with. This is the only thing that they know. This is the formula that they've been taught to write. And they haven't been taught that you can branch out. You need to think about all these points and these supporting ideas that you're going to need to ultimately argue your thesis, and that it is ultimately the responsibility of the writer to determine how many supporting paragraphs they're going to need before they reach the conclusion, which kind of wraps up everything and kind of takes the time to remind our reader, hey, remember, this is what I was arguing, remember these points that I made. Okay, I just want to make sure you remember it before you leave this discussion, because that's what your conclusion does. And so we need to get basic writers to think beyond the 5-paragraph structure. And I am not saying that the 5-paragraph essay format doesn't work in some instances. I can think of one instance in college writing, I'm saying this with hesitancy, but whatever, where it can work is in timed writing situations. I do know that there are still some sections where timed writing is still being used to demonstrate academic knowledge. And sometimes students tend to panic over those situations where you only have like anywhere between an hour to 2 hours to write an essay for your instructor. And so sometimes students spend a fair amount of time just, overwhelmed by how to structure the essay. And so, in order to kind of alleviate that stress and so they can just move into the topic, I tell students, follow that 5-paragraph formula. Go into your introduction, make 3 supporting points, have a conclusion, and if you can build more supporting paragraphs, great, but at least you have the basic structure down. And I've used it. I've known many of my peers who have used it, throughout, our academic careers, in order to, alleviate some stress with the time writing situations. But that's not to say that in those time writing situations we strictly adhered to the 5 paragraph formula. We just used it as a basic foundation in order to move quickly into the time writing topic. So that's an instance where I can think of where it can help. But I definitely think that basic writers need to understand that it's essentially like the training wheels to the writing process, and that we need to remove them, and you need to begin thinking about not the 5 paragraph as a formula, as like the tried and true structure, but just as like kind of like the basic foundation that we then need to kind of build on in order to create and practice more sophisticated writing styles. Which takes me to the final myth. Changing your writing style for your audience is selling out. No. No. Your audience is who you need to think about to move from basic to more sophisticated writing. Sophisticated writers understand that it is ultimately their audience that they're trying to persuade, that they are trying to convey that message to them, that they need to appeal to them, and that experienced writers spend a fair amount of time thinking and role playing what type of reader, what type of audience are going to come to their text. And then from there, they plan accordingly. So, changing your writing style to fit the needs of your audience is not selling out, but is in fact the mark of an experienced writer. I cannot emphasize that enough. So, hope you enjoyed some of these common myths and misconceptions about the writing process. But like I said, this isn't the only myths and misconceptions. These are just some of the myths and misconceptions, and I'm sure I'm going to be encountering more and having to address other myths and misconceptions in the future. But for right now, I think that this is a pretty good place to start, and hopefully I've worked to dispel some of your own misconceptions about the writing process and help you begin understanding what the writing process entails, and the one thing that I want to make sure that you take away from this video is understanding that writing is discovery. It's a process. It's not linear. It's recursive. And that good writers depend on our readers, depend on our audience. So it's not done in isolation. So, all right. So I'm just going to go ahead and end that here. And hopefully you learn a little bit something about the writing process.